Well, I'm excited to have Dr. Mark Winborn here today with us to talk about some of his work and his writing. Excited to present some of his point of views on interpretation. Good to have you here, Mark.
Thank you, Alexis. Appreciate it.
All right, so Mark is a Jungian analyst and a clinical psychologist. From 1988 to 1990, he was the staff psychologist at the United States Military Academy, West Point in New York. Dr. Winborn is a training and supervising analyst of the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts, the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, Switzerland, and the Moscow Association for Analytical Psychology Postgraduate Studies program. He currently serves on the American Board for Accreditation in Psychoanalysis and the Ethics Committee of the International Association for Analytical Psychology. He's on the editorial boards of the Journal of Analytical Psychology and the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, and is also a member of the National Association for the Advancement of Psychoanalysis. His publications, which we will talk about one in particular today, include Deep Blues, Human Soundscapes for the Archetypal Journey, and Shared Realities, Participation, Mystique, and Beyond, which is one of my favorites, and Interpretation and Jungian Analysis, Art and Technique, which is the one we will be focusing on today. As well as other books, chapters, and articles. Since then, he's maintained a private practice in Memphis, Tennessee, and I'm in Florida, so not too far away from each other.
There we go. All right.
All right, so to start off, I'd like to kind of give people a picture of the landscape in the Jungian field. I don't think a lot of people out there on the internet understand this or have a good grasp of this, but can you explain the difference between the schools of Jung's work and why the developmental school is significant when it comes to analysis and significant to you?
Yeah, let me just give a kind of an overview of the field. So there's Carl Jung's work that's embodied in his 20-volume collected works, and then a variety of ancillary volumes, and the work of Maria Louise von Franz, and that's considered what's called most often the classical school. In the late 1940s, early 1950s, a British Jungian analyst named Michael Fordham started incorporating psychoanalytic ideas and mixing them with Jung's ideas, and particularly the influence of the early life of the infant and with Carl Jung's ideas. And that became first known as the London School because all of the practitioners of this orientation were residing in London. And then it eventually became known as the developmental school of Jungian analysis as it spread out into larger parts of the world. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, primarily the 1960s, James Hillman started writing, and he had some deviations from Jung, and he called his modifications of Jung's theories archetypal psychology. And so that's known as archetypal psychology or Hillmanian psychology. And in a lot of ways, his work influenced the field, and a lot of it's been reabsorbed into the mainstream of analytical psychology, and it's not quite seen so much as being different from classical Jungian analysis as much as it used to be. And now there's one more field emerging, or one more thread emerging around the work of a man named Gigerich. And his work is, they refer to it as the subject of interiority. And it's a critique of Jung. It's a very rigorous intellectual critique, but there's also modifications of the way one works clinically based on these theories that Gigerich has developed, and a variety of other authors, writers have gathered around him. So those are what I consider the four main threads in Jungian analysis, and I practice out of the developmental perspective. So the incorporation of a lot of different schools of thought, whether it's Melanie Klein, or object relations theory, or more recently, intersubjectivity. Those are the primary sources, along with self-psychology, that I draw from and integrate with my clinical training in the Jungian world.
Yeah, so I'm interested in how you got kind of into this space in particular, and why the developmental school kind of called you.
Well, that really came directly out of my training. I did my training in the Interregional Society, and the Interregional Society actually has about 8 different cities we train in, and then we do all of our examinations, our admissions, our evaluations at the, it's not exactly the national level, at the larger level. So all of the training takes place at the local level. All of the other administrative things take place as part of the larger group. And I trained in Memphis. And one of the faculty members that was coming in on a regular basis was a woman named Mel Marshak. And she was an American who had gone over to London in her late 20s, early 30s, and done both medical training and psychological training there in London. So she was a combined MD, PhD, PhD in clinical psychology and an MD. And then she did her Jungian analytic training in London. And she was very much a part of that whole milieu of influences. She supervised with Michael Fordham. She had her office over a British Jungian analyst named Gerhard Adler, who was quite prominent in maintaining the classical thread in London. Mm-hmm. And she was present for, really significant events in the analytic world, like the Melanie Klein and Freud debates that took place in London in the 1940s and 50s. And so she was just a wellhouse of knowledge about that era and spoke very evocatively about it. But she was also incredibly well-read and intelligent, and could articulate her position so crisply. And I could tell that her approach was very different than many of the other analysts that I was exposed to. And she was one of the few analysts who would actually illustrate theories from her own case notes. People would talk abstractly about their clinical work, but she would literally bring in notes from sessions about what was actually said, the verbatim of what was actually said. And I could tell she was doing something significantly different, that these other analysts, as good as they were, simply didn't have that capacity that she had. And that's what ultimately led me to focus a lot on the psychoanalytic integration, but also to really focus on interpretation, because she would go in so precisely, but in a very affectively connected way, right to the heart of the matter, in a way that was, I couldn't understand how it was done initially. It was almost like magic to me initially when I would hear this.
Yeah, that's interesting. So she was associated with Michael Fordham.
Yes, she trained in the Society of Analytical Psychology, which is kind of where the whole London School, developmental school, originated from.
Yeah, and you reference Fordham a lot in your work, and mm-hmm. I think, I've always been drawn to him because he does have one of the few, books published on technique, some of his mm-hmm. work focusing on that. And I remember I had the analyst that I worked with for a long time, she just passed, but she was very anti-technique. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of me and the work that I've done. I've moved a little bit more towards exploring, well, what could technique bring and what does it look like for Jungians?
Yeah, my argument is always that technique is a tool, it's not a set of rules. You know, so jazz musicians, I'm a music buff, among other things, and jazz musicians spend years dedicated to their developing their craft, you know, of the technical aspects of their instrument and of learning the theory behind music, the scales, the modes, the chord structures, the harmonies. And they don't think of it as inhibiting their creativity. They think of it as freeing their creativity. So that whole attitude that is very prominent in the Jungian world of being anti-technique is just completely puzzling to me, about how they think that somehow that's going to damage the spontaneity or creativity or the emergence of soul in a session. It's not. It's going to create more opportunities for those qualities to be liberated, because you're not introducing a lot of other static into the field that's unnecessary and actually interferes with the work.
Yeah, would you say that we have a technique, whether we know it or like it or not, that it's best to hone it rather than
I think actually, I think this will end up sounding rather critical, but I think, yes, we do have, you could say we have technique, the way we do it as an extension of our personality. So there is a naturalistic technique based on our own personality and our preferences. But if we don't reflect on what our technique is, then we're doing all sorts of things unconsciously,
yeah,
you know, that interfere with the process at worst, or don't facilitate the process to go deeper.
yeah,
And I could give you all kinds of examples of that. And when I'm supervising both candidates in training to be analysts or often other analysts, they're often unaware of things that they do habitually without reflection that interfere with the process, whether it's across the board with all of their patients or more specifically with individual patients.
which is just why it's so important to get that training.
Right, right.
And there's so many out there right now that seem to think that they don't need training at all, which is baffling to me.
Right. It's baffling to me that there are people that can do therapy without a concept of the unconscious and with no personal experience in dealing with their own unconscious processes.
Yeah. So as a younger depth therapist myself, I work with many clients who have yet to reach midlife. And this work is still very fruitful and very much possible. And I think I felt that with myself going through it. The developmental school approaches analysis from the perspective that individuation is not limited to after midlife, like Jung proposed. How does this affect your understanding of individuation?
Well, I'm certainly in the camp of Michael Fordham, who was the first one to develop within the Jungian world, to propose a lifespan theory of individuation. So just to backtrack briefly for those listeners who don't know about it, Jung's idea of individuation is the process of coming into balance with oneself. And he saw that as largely happening in the second half of life. He felt that we would, as we established ourselves out in the world and developed a identity around family, community, culture, occupation, that at some point that would become solidified and we would enter into a transition towards less an extroverted orientation to life and more an introverted orientation to life, in which we would turn inward more towards questions of meaning, spirituality, understanding ourselves, developing what's been left undeveloped as we tried to establish ourselves in the world. Mm-hmm. So that's in the individuation of the second half of life, which was Jung's position on it. Michael Fordham, because he worked with young children and eventually went through infant observation training at 80, which is rather remarkable, he had firsthand experiences with a lot of watching, observing a lot of infants and doing analysis with a lot of children, particularly children who had been traumatized during World War II. And he developed the idea that individuation begins at birth. Mm-hmm. And that we are born with a primary or nuclear self that exists as a potential, and that we require a nurturing environment to help us unpack that potential. And so he developed this theory called the integrate theory of individuation. So that the idea is these deintegrates are parts of our primary or nuclear self that are waiting to be deintegrated through interactions with our environment and others. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, we would put them out into the world. The person who's around us digests them in some way and then feeds them back to the infant so that they can be reintegrated as an actual experience rather than a potential experience. And that the self is gradually unpacked and built up through interaction, which is a very different kind of self than the transcendent self that's connected to the archetypal world that Jung was describing. Mm-hmm. Fordham felt like all of this process precedes a sense of the transcendent self, but is still part of the emergence of the transcendent self.
Yeah. Yes.
So this was completely new, and I think it is incredibly accurate and foresighted to what we know about development now from infant research, not just psychoanalytic infant research, but analytic research as a whole, or infant research as a whole, that this is clearly happening. And when it's disrupted, it clearly has traumatic impact on the infant. Mm-hmm. So it directly applies to what your original question was about, is Jungian analysis applicable to younger people starting out in life, and does it have something to offer them in terms of understanding themselves and facilitating their development at the stage of life they're at? And I would say absolutely, that's absolutely the case. And it also has something to say about an idea that gets floated around Jungian circles, but also about broader psychoanalytic circles of what's a good analytic patient. You know, like, does somebody have to dream? Does somebody have to do creative art as part of their interior process? Does somebody have to keep a journal in order to benefit from these ideas? And I would say no, anybody can benefit. It's more the attitude that the therapist or the analyst holds in relationship to their material. Mm-hmm. So even if somebody doesn't respond in what we call a symbolic fashion, the analyst can still observe symbolic activity going on and find some ways to feed that back to the patient in digestible, understandable language that is consistent with where they're at, and gradually deepen that person over time. So I don't think there is, quote, the analytic patient that's appropriate for this work. I think anybody's appropriate for this work.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, that brings up a question about symbolic thinking for me. and kind of how we foster that in the analytic relationship. Do you,
Mhm.
I mean, this might be a silly question, but is there a point in life where you think that symbolic thinking is more appropriate, or it starts to get more, it becomes more of a possibility?
I think that there can often be a movement towards a more interior relationship after we've, in a sense, moved past some of the ego anxieties we have. You know, like, am I attractive enough? Am I successful enough? Am I smart enough? You know, all of the things that almost everybody carries around anxieties about. And once you've settled some of those questions, it becomes easier to take up other ideas, like meaning, like symbolic process. But I don't think it's a particular stage of life as much as it is a capacity. You know, so I'll, you know, be sometimes surprised that people who have a high educational level uh, and are obviously intelligent sometimes respond incredibly concretely
Mhm.
to symbolic material that either emerges from their dreams or that I point out in their language use or that I'll introduce through a metaphor, and they just have a very difficult time getting it. And some people never get it. And then some people that appear to have a very limited symbolic capacity all of a sudden open up to it and become very capable of working with symbolic material. So I think of it less as a lifespan thing that one enters into, and much more of a capacity that's developed or not developed.
Well, that brings me to my next question, which is about metaphors. So I understand the use of metaphor in analysis as being quite different from the ways in which maybe, you know, cognitive therapists use it in clinical counseling. Can you speak to this deeper use of metaphor and how you approach it in application?
Well, the use of metaphor in other contexts, I think, is somewhat like using it almost. I think of it as using it manipulatively, in the sense that they've got a metaphor they like, and they introduce it often across a wide variety of people, and it's just there's nothing wrong with that, but it's kind of like a cookie cutter approach to metaphor. You know, like the metaphor that therapists love. Well, we're peeling back the onion, you know,
I'm guilty of using that one.
and so there's nothing wrong with that, and it's certainly a useful illustration for the process of therapy that you pull back one layer and it reveals another. Okay. But what I'm interested in is metaphors that occur spontaneously in a particular analytic moment with a particular analyst patient dyad. When it's floating up out of what's happening in that room, it's not something I've preconceived and think, oh, I'll introduce that now. The most valuable, most transformative ones are always one that happen in the moment.
Yeah, so I'm thinking of just this kind of, I don't know, I love the way that you write about this phenomenon in therapy and how it can be so fruitful and really deep in the relationship, or that work together, that spontaneity together is dependent on the relationship. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe the science of metaphor and how important it is to symbolic thinking and, you know, the work that we do with patients?
Yeah, that is really fascinating work. You could say that Freud and Jung both came to an appreciation of metaphor kind of intuitively. They had a sense that something was of significance, like Freud naming the Oedipus complex and associating, oh, there's particular dynamics, particular configuration of human dynamics that look a lot like the themes of the play Oedipus Rex. And so that's a metaphor. okay? But they didn't have any background to say why that was happening. Jung developed his theory of archetypes in part to explain that phenomenon. And he said there's these universal patterns of human experience that get played out across time and across culture and across individuals. And that was his explanation for it. Now flash forward to the 2000s, and this research started to emerge, particularly around a guy named Philip Davis, who was a professor of literature at the University of Liverpool. And he's an expert on Shakespeare, but he wanted to know, why is there such an enduring power to Shakespeare's words? And Shakespeare's always creating spontaneous metaphors through his odd grammatical structure and reinvention of words, and sometimes using nouns as verbs, things like that, using them in the syntactically in the way they're not supposed to be used, but they still make sense within Shakespeare's word usage. So he got with the neuroscience department, and they started recruiting volunteers to read ordinary prose passages like you would read in a newspaper or in a magazine, and putting them in a functional MRI machine and observing their brainwave activity, or not their brainwave activity, but the activity of their brain in real time, as well as an electroencephalogram, which is measuring their brain waves. And they could tell that the subjects' brains were responding very differently to reading prose than it was to metaphor, and that the whole brain lights up and becomes engaged when metaphor is introduced. And they were using initially passages from Shakespeare, but then they replicated it with other authors, other poets in particular, that use a lot of metaphor in their writing. So they demonstrated it not just for Shakespeare, but about a variety of authors that use a lot of metaphor. So the conclusion is, not just from this study, but from several other studies that have done similar types of things, is that our brain itself, our whole neurological system, is optimized to respond to metaphor, whether we know it's happening or not. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's such a powerful tool to enter into unconscious relationship with somebody else, is that it bypasses defenses that we have, and it has a deep penetrating impact whether somebody wants it to or not, whether they're symbolic thinkers or not. Now, obviously, somebody who's a symbolic thinker who can process the implications of a symbol are going to unpack it and do more with it. But even for somebody who, let's stereotype somebody who drives a truck for a living and only is interested in watching baseball and drinking beer on the weekends, it's going to have a deep effect on them too, whether they know it or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I love this. This is one of my favorite topics, and why I love this book so much, that on interpretation, considering what I'm writing for my dissertation on the archetype of Hecate, who is, from an analytical perspective, exactly kind of this moment that we're talking about in many ways, this feminine aspect of Hermes that unifies both these opposites, and even both sides of the brains here, like we're speaking about, this bridge to this creative energy. So just fascinating. And my brain goes a million directions on this topic, but I'm going to go to the next question now.
Okay.
Interpretation is kind of a hot debate in the Jungian space, like we've talked about before. And perspectives vary between schools of analytical psychology and psychoanalysis at large. I was excited to read in Interpretation and Jungian Analysis, Art and Technique that you understood the approach to interpretation as a sort of middle way and relationally interdependent, something that happens between analyst and analyst, like we were just talking about. Can you expand on this and maybe explain the difference between too little interpretation, too much interpretation, and kind of what happens when we can employ it artistically or relationally?
Yeah, I think the stereotype that kind of held the acceptance of interpretation back is the idea that it's a cold, distant, observational therapist or analyst making this pronouncement about what's happening in or for the patient. And that it's an intellectual idea. And that caricature, and there's reasons, particularly in the way psychoanalysis was practiced in the United States in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, into the 50s even, that the caricature is somewhat deserved. And Jungians never have developed a theory of interpretation. They have a theory of dream interpretation, and to some extent they have a theory of archetypal amplification, but neither of those things is what my book addresses, which is how to articulate and utilize what's happening in the session when dreams are not being discussed, the interpretation of the analytic interaction. And so I look at the entire session as like a dream. And so anything is open for interpretation. And so an interpretation is not everything that's said to a patient or client. Often that's one of the misconceptions, is that when somebody's doing mirroring responses, empathic responses, those are not interpretations. Okay, those are important and necessary to facilitate the relational sense of warmth between two individuals. And that's a necessary component of good analysis or good therapy. But an interpretation tries to make a link between something that's observable to the patient, whether it's a feeling, a thought that they've just expressed, a behavior they've just done, that they can see from a conscious perspective, and then tries to make a link between that observable behavior, feeling, or thought to an unconscious script that operates within their world. And so sometimes it's going to be an interpretation about something that's happened in the patient's past, how they're experiencing their present, or something that it seems to anticipate where they're going in the future. Or an interpretation might focus on what's happening between the patient and the analyst. But it's specifically intended to make linkages between conscious thought, behavior, feeling, and unconscious process. That's the goal. It explains something. Oh, this is what's going on inside, and as a result, that prompts you to respond in this way.
Yeah, so right then again, kind of merging those opposites together in session, trying to bring that up for them.
Right, and conscious and unconscious is one set of opposites, perhaps the most fundamental set of opposites to any depth psychology.
Yeah, I find it interesting. I know the archetypal school is very kind of hesitant towards interpretation and sticking to the image, they always say over and over again. But I think we can have both. I think we can definitely do both, just like you're saying that in other areas of the analysis, there can be this interpretive action while also sticking to the symbolic images and not overly interpreting them.
Right. And there's certainly a great value that comes from sticking with the image. But because there's for me, the problem with the archetypal approach and the idea of stick with the image, let soul speak through the image, is that it doesn't really take into account the notion of defense mechanisms. And there's actually not much addressing of defense mechanisms in the classical Jungian perspective either. It's primarily in the developmental school that we take strong consideration of defense mechanisms. Everybody knows about the idea of repression, that we hold things out of awareness unconsciously that make us uncomfortable. And that's primarily the defense mechanism that Jung refers to the most, as well as dissociation. He felt that complexes were a result of elements of experience being dissociated from conscious awareness, and that's how complexes develop. But there's a wide variety of defense mechanisms, and defense mechanisms have to be engaged. I find a lot of therapists and analysts often try to circumvent and pretend as though the defense mechanisms don't exist and that you can go around them somehow. And you can't. They're part of the unconscious process too. Mm-hmm. And they have to be engaged, sometimes confronted, sometimes gently lifted up. But in one way or another, the person who carries the defenses has to be made aware of them in order for them to make choices about them. There's a really marvelous sculpture in Philadelphia that I have an image of in the book, in the interpretation book by a guy named Zenos Fridakis. And it depicts these 4 bronze figures, and the first one's completely embedded in the wall. The next one's just able to pull an arm away from the wall. In the third frame of the sculpture, which is slightly larger than life size, so it's very impressive when you're standing in it, is somebody who's just barely attached to the wall still. And the fourth image is somebody who's broken completely free of the wall. And I think that's the goal of analysis, is to increase degrees of freedom in the individual, not to get them to be successful people or to get them to behave a certain way in society, but for them to have an experience of being less encumbered by their own internal restrictions that hold them back from a full experience of themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's such a great image for the personal experience with individuation, that is a big
exactly.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, my next question, I think we covered it already a little bit, but speaking to the importance of the symbolic attitude, different than symbolic thinking. So Jung's symbolic attitude or the analytic attitude, why is this so necessary?
Well, the symbolic attitude is something that Jung hoped would develop in each patient as analysis progressed. And the symbolic attitude is one that takes almost anything as being more than what it first appears. So if let's say you have a dream in which you're driving a car and suddenly the steering wheel becomes loose and you can't control the car anymore. Well, somebody who doesn't have a symbolic attitude is not going to stay with that image very long. Oh yeah, they might say something like, oh yeah, that would be really frightening, wouldn't it? Mm-hmm. And if you said, well, does anything else come to mind? And they might say something very concretely, like, well, I guess I'd want to take my car into the shop and get that fixed as soon as possible. In other words, it doesn't take the image beyond where it is. Mm-hmm. Whereas somebody who has some capacity for symbolic thinking might be able to make the transition. Oh, I suppose the steering wheel might symbolize something else in my life other than driving. Oh, that might symbolize a feeling of loss of control in my life and how threatening that loss of control is. And then they might take it a bit further. I wonder what So they might say, yeah, it feels like my marriage is really out of control. And they start to make linkages between the literal image of the steering wheel and their marriage. And then somebody might, who's more deeply symbolic, might begin to wonder, well, I wonder where other areas where I feel like I'm driving a car that has a steering wheel that's become detached. So they're able to broaden it out. It continues to broaden, continues to take on more weight and significance and more implications. Mm-hmm. And that's really the heart of the symbolic attitude, is the attitude that can look at something, hear something, and respond to it in a very broad way that allows other implications of the primary image to emerge. Now, Jung typically wrote about it as something that develops in the patient, but really it's at the heart of the analyst's analytic attitude. And the analyst's analytic attitude is one in which our primary goal is not making somebody feel better. It's not helping them develop better coping strategies. It's specifically an attitude that tries to facilitate as much as possible the emergence of the unconscious and to facilitate the overall development of the individual's personality as a whole. Not to get rid of depression, not to modify obsessive compulsive patterns, not to keep somebody from drinking or using drugs, although those certainly can be parts of any depth approach to therapy. But they're, from an analytic perspective, they're byproducts, they're secondary. That if we're keeping our focus on engaging with the unconscious and trying to understand the implications of that for our understanding of ourselves, our relationships around us, and the world around us, then those other things kind of take care of themselves.
Yeah, there's an excellent diagram of the analytic attitude included in the book. I don't know if you can relay it from memory, but I think it would be excellent if we talked about kind of what that looks like. And with that, it's looking very similar to the next image that we're going to work with the archetype.
Okay, I'm having a bit of trouble remembering which image that you're referring to.
Yeah, there's a picture of, let's see, it should come up real quick here. Of the analytic attitude. It describes it's kind of like a wheel, and it goes through, maybe I won't be able to find it now.
Oh, that's the one really connected more to metaphor, I think. I mean, to reverie.
Yeah, the reverie is definitely is a part of it, and then there's this part here.
Right.
It starts with dreams and fantasies and ends with defense and resistance.
Right. Yeah, I know which one you're speaking about now. And so my goal with that image is all of the elements of an analytic or depth psychology perspective that we tend to think of as in isolation. How do I work with dreams? How do I work with defenses and resistance? How do I work with the transference, countertransference? But all of those things should be guided by our analytic attitude. So let me give just a very brief analytic attitude. And the idea of one of the components of analytic attitude that I mentioned in the book is foreclosure, which is a literary term of when a writer crafts a particular passage in a way that forecloses on other possibilities from happening. Sometimes you want foreclosure, but sometimes it kind of ruins the trajectory of the story because now there's only one possibility. So like, let's say one of your patients goes on vacation and they come back from vacation and your first words is, "Oh, how was your vacation?" Well, you've just foreclosed on whatever the patient had planned to talk about or whatever might be emerging from their unconscious because you've now set the initial topic for the session.
Yeah.
So even something simple like that reflects an analytic attitude.
It's like I learned from my analyst, we always started session with what's up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's on your mind?
Mm-hmm.
What comes to mind right now?
Mm-hmm. So, sometimes in analysis, it is necessary to open the patient up to what Jung defines as psychic realities, kind of in line with what we're talking about. Can you describe what this is and how it transcends our ordinary ego reality or modes of logic, and why this is so important?
Well, most people, particularly in our culture, which is kind of the United States culture is kind of an extroverted culture, a culture of consumption and entertainment. And so the ego likes to be comfortable. It doesn't want to be disturbed. So we have a particular image of ourselves in the world that we're comfortable with, and analysis is by definition and necessity disruptive. So most people are going to come in hoping for something to change, but often engaging in a way that limits change. Everybody wants to feel that they're their master of their own house, and we're not. That's the ego. The ego wants to believe it's the master of its own house and that we're in control. And as the events of 2020 so aptly demonstrate, we're not in control of our own house nor anything else. And so anybody can develop a symptom of something at any time. And so that's a lot of the work of psychic reality, is first to confront the ego's desire to keep things the same. So sometimes I might confront somebody, not in an aggressive way, but a confrontation of their perspective, where they might dismiss a lot of what I'm saying. And I'll say, so I'll step back and make a broader observation and say, it's interesting, isn't it? You said that you wanted to come in to work on this, but actually each time that particular topic comes up, it seems as if everything that you do is geared towards avoiding that particular topic. And then I'll just wait and see what they do. That's a confrontation. That's not immediately linked to what they've just said, but it's connected to a broader observation of how they're utilizing therapy. So then I'm creating a tension between their stated reason for being in therapy and how they actually utilize therapy, which is sometimes very different.
Yeah. Absolutely. And you very much get to know the two personalities, like Jung often talked about, the one that brought you there and the one that doesn't want to be there.
So it's very appropriate to speak about individuation forces in analysis and anti-individuation forces in analysis.
Yeah, fascinating. So going back to kind of what we were talking about with psychic reality, how do we get them to find a balance without fully denying the reality that we have to live in? Like, we're very playful and we want to kind of be in that non-linear space or that symbolic space, breaking up that other ego reality. But in the book, you also write about not wanting to completely deny that reality. And you mentioned this in your interdeterminacy principle.
Right. So there's some distortions of reality need to be tolerated in analysis. So there's a guy named Harold Searles who was a prominent analyst in the Washington, D.C. area. He's deceased now, but he worked a lot with schizophrenics. And he often worked in an inpatient facility where there was long-term residential treatment for schizophrenics. And he had this patient named Mrs. Douglas, and she comes in one day and says, should I bring my dog to a session? And he knows her history. He knows she doesn't have a dog residing with her in this institutional setting. And he says, well, I don't know. How big of a dog is it? And she gestures. And he said, oh, not too big. Not so big that it would create a disruption. And she says, no, I don't think. Now she's completely, this is real to her. It's delusional. But he's staying with her. And he says, oh, so why do you think your dog might want to come to the session? And she says, well, he's sad. And he says, well, how sad is your dog? And she says, oh, he's very sad. I think he wants to die. And Searles just kind of leans back and says, after a moment of pause, and says, well, he certainly should come then. And then he's done something really powerful and magical. I mean, it brings tears to my eyes every time I recite that scene, because it's such a beautifully human moment, but illustrates well this. He needed to enter into her psychic reality in order to know about this part of herself that wanted to die and accept the part of herself in the session, even though she's not thinking of it as, oh, this is part of me. She's thinking of it as a real dog. But by tolerating her psychic reality and entering into it, he's able to work in a transformative way with that. Now, often with people who are not psychotic, the job is to help them see the value of being able to recognize and tolerate and understand and learn from our psychic reality. That what Jung essentially says, what we dream while we're dreaming it is just as real to us as waking life. And that's kind of the fundamental principle of psychic reality and why he places so much emphasis on dreams. And it's getting the patient to the point, often through working with their dreams, that they come to see that dreams are speaking about and helping them digest and transform, move towards different experiences than they would be able to do through their own ego approach to how should I solve this problem. I was working with a woman just last week, and she brings in this dream that has 3 phases to it, and has obsessive compulsive disorder, and each phase of the dream is clearly speaking of creating situations that allow us to look at different aspects of the obsessive compulsive disorder. And she gets a bit frustrated and she says, I know I've got obsessive compulsive disorder. That's not telling me anything new. And I said, no, it's not telling you anything new about the obsessive compulsive disorder, but it is telling you something about how you hold your obsessive compulsive disorder and what you're doing with it. And then the light bulb goes off and she sees kind of that there is an intelligence in her own dreams that's well beyond her ego capacity to resolve it on her own.
Wow.
And that happens all of the time. It happens to me in my own dreams, and it happens with my patients not with everybody in every single session, but multiple times every single week.
That's why I think, when it comes to dream work too, with this method of interpretation and also kind of allowing some of these interpretations in the relationship through observation to come through. You would be, like von Franz says, being negligent if we don't do that with the dream.
And then sometimes it comes in through in other things like slips of the tongue, even while working with dreams. So I'm during sessions, I'm writing almost continuously. And particularly when somebody's telling me the dream, I record the dream exactly as they're telling it to me. And then we'll go back through the dream. And like one patient told me, no, I didn't say that. I said this. And I said, well, you know, I'm pretty closely paying attention to what you're saying, and this is what you said. And so I asked him for his associations to both versions. A particular type of knife that he mentioned that I didn't recognize, but there's a name of a commercially available knife similar to that. And so I said, well, what do you think of when you think of, the image was a buck knife, which is a hunting knife that has a single blade. You use it to skin animals with. He said, well, it's simple and direct and straightforward. And then he named, what I heard him say was something I didn't have a reference for. And I said, well, what do you think of when you think of this? And I won't name the place, but he said, well, actually, that's a place I went the last vacation. I went with my wife that we actually got along. And I said, well, what was different about that vacation? And he said, actually, it was like the buck knife. It was simple and direct and straightforward. You can't, I mean, I couldn't make that stuff up if I was writing fiction.
Exactly. Wow.
You know, the intelligence that's demonstrated in those kind of both the dream image and the slip of the tongue that revealed the connection between the place and the knife was just, I mean, it makes the, you know, the hair on your arm stand up.
Yeah, just reveals, again, especially for people listening, the difference between the type of dream work that we want to kind of fancy and do on our own, but the dream work that happens in session and in this type of analytic relationship, it's completely different and very hard to do on our own. I think it's important to play with our symbols, but it's also very important to do this type of work, which is completely different than what the mainstream might understand.
It is, but I'll say that dream work that's done on one's own is, as long as there's a turning towards the dream, whether you get all of the right interpretation down or not, it's the attitude of turning towards the dream, which is turning towards the unconscious and saying, I'm here, I'm open, I'm receptive. That is the fundamental thing that we need. So there's certainly a difference in the kind of dream work done in an analytic session and the dream work done alone, but they both have that commonality that we're turning our face towards the unconscious. And most often the unconscious returns the favor.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mark, for coming to kind of explicate some of those deeper concepts for us. I think it is just invaluable to have you speak to these things with me, and also everything that you've written in this book. I can't recommend it enough for folks that are listening. If you're interested in these topics, especially if you are a therapist or therapist in training, I'll just hold the book up here for a second. It's a beautiful cover. Really speaks to what we've been talking about. So it was lovely to meet you today.
Well, thank you, Alexis. And we're talking about things that are enlivening and fun for me to talk about. And, you know, the thing I tell often in my classes for people who are analysts, therapists in training is to say, if you go into it with depth, it only gets better year after year, decade after decade. I've been after it. I've been doing it for 33 years now. And each decade it gets better and deeper and richer.
Absolutely. Can't agree more. Well, thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Alexis.